I'm sure most of you are familiar with the fact that we have to stand for the national anthem in the theatre or cinema halls before the movie begins. Likewise, before any match starts, that is to say, before any national match starts, the national anthem of the country is played. As we can see here, the players of the Indian cricket team standing and singing the national anthem of India. It gives us a sense of pride. It gives us a sense of belonging to the nation we were born in, to the nation that we reside in. And at the same time, this national anthem also unites the people. This national anthem gives us a kind of national identity. Many of you might also get goosebumps when you sing this national anthem. But do you know what this spirit, what this feeling is all about? This is actually the feeling of nationalism. So let us now begin talking about what this concept of nationalism is all about. The concept of nationalism is a kind of we feeling that is shared by the citizens of a country. So the citizens of a country feel a sense of rootedness, feel a sense of belonging to one united country. And all the citizens are tied together by this one unified bond. Nationalism gives us a sense of pride, a sense of unity. Because when we know that we belong to a nation and a nation also belongs to us, we feel rooted to the same. Now, this lesson will be about nationalism in India. Now, I'm sure very important questions that might be coming to your mind are that, how did these nationalistic sentiments start growing and surging in the minds of the Indian masses? Well, if we are to trace the growth of nationalism in India, it will be very different from what happened in the European nations. Now, through the 19th century, many new nation-states were coming to being in Europe. And these nation-states were giving a sense of unity, a sense of purpose, a sense of national identity to the citizens. But the history of nationalism in India, or be that in other Asian and African countries, is very different. This is because nationalism is intricately rooted with anti-colonial spirits and sentiments, and it's not just in India, but it happened so throughout many African and Asian countries which were colonized by the European powers. So in this lesson, while we will be talking about how nationalism grew in India, how it suffused the minds of Indian masses, we will be doing so through the lens of the Indian national movement, through the anti-colonial movements, as in how the Indian masses, filled with nationalistic sentiments, filled with a sense of pride and belonging to India, were fighting against the British colonial rule. So let us now begin this very fascinating adventure where we will be learning about nationalism in India. As we mentioned all this while, nationalism gives a sense of collective belonging. Now, if we are to take into account nationalism in India, we will have to see how various sections of the Indian population were severely repressed, tortured and discriminated against by the colonial officers, by the colonial rule at large. And so these people had their own struggles. They were fighting in their own distinctive ways to overthrow colonial rule from the Indian subcontinent. But while their experiences were quite different, as in while different sections of the society were being tortured and exploited in different ways by the British colonial rule, they were unified at one level. Their struggles were directed against the British colonial rule, and it is this experience of united struggles that gave people a sense of belonging to India. Just a while ago we mentioned this point that during the colonial period, different sections of the Indian society were being exposed to brutalities, discriminations, injustices in different kinds of ways. Now here we see the example of peasants. Now peasants were the poorer lot, and they already had to work very hard in order to earn their living. Now when the Britishers were here to rule the Indian subcontinent, they wanted to maximize the revenue earned from the lands. And so they kept on imposing different kinds of taxes. They had very huge demands that the peasants were expected to fulfill. But how could the peasants fulfill such huge demands? It was very difficult for them. They were already poor. Moreover, they were not even allowed to grow the crops which suited the lands as well as their living. They had to grow the crops which were dictated by the British colonial officers. And so, the peasants often found it very difficult to meet the revenue demands. And when they failed to pay the taxes, pay the revenue which the government was extorting from them, their lands were being acquired. So what was happening because of the failure of payment of taxes was that forceful acquisition of the lands of the peasants. So these peasants' lands were being taken away from them and given to certain absentee landlords, and they were evicted from their lands. So they already did not have sufficient money, sufficient resources to lead a healthy and prosperous life, and on top of it they were also being thrown out of their lands. So this was a major source of resentment that kept on brewing up in the minds of the peasants during the colonial rule in the Indian subcontinent. The Industrial Revolution had drastically changed lives in Europe in every possible way, because the European countries were now heavily relying upon the industries, the machines which were copiously producing more and more amount of goods. And in order to make these machines run, in order to have the factories running, it was very important for these European countries to procure huge amounts of raw materials. Now when the British rule was established in the Indian subcontinent, they now started following a policy of export and import. What was this? The Britishers were taking away all the important raw materials that were available in the Indian subcontinent. So the raw materials were being exported to England, and in turn finished machine-made British goods were being imported. So this was a very ruthless thing happening to the Indian masses at this point of time. On the one hand, there were the British, who were taking away all the raw materials, all the resources that were available in the Indian subcontinent. And then these raw materials and resources were being used to produce finished goods in the factories and industries in England. And then the British were sending their finished goods to Indian markets. So in this way, the Indian markets were being flooded by huge amounts of goods which were produced in England. And as a result of this, the British goods now posed a stiff competition to Indian handicrafts, because Indian handicrafts were quite expensive, and at the same time it was quite laborious and time consuming to produce these items of handicrafts manually. On the other hand, these British goods were very readily and easily available, and they kept on flooding the Indian markets. As a result of this, the Indian artisans, the Indian craftspersons, were severely suffering because of this policy of export of raw materials and import of machine-made British goods. Now, with time, so many new kinds of commodities which were made in Britain completely filled the Indian markets. And as a result of this, the demand for Indian goods kept on decreasing. And when the demand for Indian goods kept on decreasing, many artisans and craftspersons lost their jobs because their goods were no longer required in huge numbers in the Indian markets, and so they were being rendered unemployed and jobless in this process. Now, all this while we talked about the peasants, the artisans, the craftspersons. Now, they belonged to the uneducated sections of the society. But what about the educated lot? Was it really easy for them to find employment in colonial India? Well, large sections of educated people also remained unemployed, and only certain people got selected and appointed in government services. So it were the uneducated and educated lots, all the sections of the society who were impacted because of the colonial rule. Now, we learned that certain people managed to bag government jobs. Now, do you think it was easy for them to continue doing these jobs? It wasn't so. Firstly, work pressure was excessive. And on top of that, salaries were quite low in comparison to what was being paid to the British counterpart. So simply on account of their racial affiliation, the Indian officers in the government services were not being paid just as much as the British officials. And at the same time, the Indians working in the British Indian government offices were also not promoted to higher positions. So this was kind of a stagnation. Even if some people got the government jobs, their work life was really bad because the government jobs were not paying them well, and at the same time they also could not secure promotions from time to time. Before proceeding with this lesson, let me ask you a question. Educated people appointed by the British government in India were well paid and often promoted to higher positions. Do you think this statement is true or false? Well, the correct answer is this statement is false, because these Indian educated people who worked in the government offices were not at all well paid, and at the same time they were not even promoted to higher positions. So we have talked about how the peasants, the artisans, or even the educated lot were affected because of the colonial rule in the Indian subcontinent. Now, some factories, some mills came up in India during the colonial period. Now, while these mills could provide employment to some people, working conditions in the factories as well as mines, tea plantations were really bad, because these people were overworked for very low wages, and so workers were also exploited by the owners. Now, these owners were mostly very wealthy, and in some cases the owners were also Britishers. So it goes without saying that they exploited these poor people who worked in the factories, the mines, or even the tea plantations. Now, all this while we have been talking about the predicament of the various sections of the Indian society during the colonial rule. And what we can see here is a very apt description of the difference that persisted during this period. Now, between 1876 and 1878, the southern part of the Indian subcontinent was absolutely ravaged by the Madras famine. Millions of people were reduced to almost nothing because of this famine. It was because these people did not have any money. And on top of that, they had to pay very high taxes to the British government. And so it became increasingly difficult for them to earn a bread. And this is what it all resulted in. It was pathetic, and this was the plight of the Indian masses, of the common people during the colonial rule in the Indian subcontinent. But in a very stark contrast to this picture, what we have here is a picture of the Grand Darbar that was held in Delhi in the year 1877. Now during this time, Lord Lytton was the Viceroy of India. He was using the riches gathered from the Indian subcontinent to hold such a huge and expensive and exorbitant affair in the form of the Grand Darbar. It was a huge manifestation of the wealth, of the riches of the British colonial government. But this also shows that the British colonial government in India did not pay heed to the real life conditions of the Indian masses. While they were being ravaged by the famine, the colonial government was busy holding such a grand and pompous exhibition at Delhi. So from this we can understand that the colonizers never took into account the interests, the requirements, the demands of the colonized population. So we come to an end of our discussion on the spirit of Indian nationalism. In the beginning of this lesson, we learnt about a very important point, that the spirit of Indian nationalism during the colonial period was very intricately tied with anti-colonial sentiments, because all these sections of the society were being exploited, were being discriminated against, were being tortured by the colonizers, and so they were drawn together, they were unified by their anti-colonial ideas. Now peasants were exploited by them, so were the artisans. The working class suffered because of the colonial rule, and in fact the educated class also suffered the same fate. So from this we can understand that Indian nationalism was not something exclusive. It was very well tied with anti-colonial sentiments, and all these anti-colonial sentiments, these angers and rebellions against the colonial rule, later on found shape and expression in the form of the Indian national movements. Different kinds of movements were launched in order to resist the colonial rule. Some ended in great success, while many ended up in fiascos. Having introduced ourselves to this concept of Indian nationalism during the colonial period, in a subsequent lesson we will learn how the Indian masses were basking in the glory of the past, of the rich legacy of the country, so as to revive this spirit of nationalism, so as to fill their minds with love and pride for their own country. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers, or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million-plus questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it's rewarding too. So register for free now.